Thank you all for that nice round of applause, and I hope this microphone doesn't make funny noises during my talk. If it does, I will abandon it and talk loudly like I do at university lectures. Last time I was invited to speak to the Fabians was on 19th century Chartist protesters and other rebels transported to Australia. So it's great to have the opportunity to kind of update that examination of working class culture and resistance. And what I'm going to talk about tonight, I've prepared a paper, and I even have, if this will work, just a little PowerPoint on that one. A very pedagogical PowerPoint, and I apologise for doing that. And the reason I did it is because I believe you're going to be broken into groups later. Is that correct? So it sounds like the old Methodist Sunday school I used to go to. So that should be all a bit of fun. So while I will be talking about certain things, many of them will be reflected on the board. And I have a lot of international students at my university. One of them is even here today. And I found it always useful to have notes up there. But what I want to talk about is kind of recent history tonight. So as recently as the 1980s, there was in Australia a lively, distinct and shared culture, best described as working class. This culture activated a sense of possibility and agency for people in communities with high concentrations of manual workers, early school leavers and low-income families, not only in neighbourhoods, workplaces and through leisure, but at a wider political level. Now, it was an agency that found expression in traditional organisations such as unions, sporting and service clubs and the ALP, but also in extracurricular activities in state schools, Catholic schools, adult education and do-it-yourself popular cultural forms such as rock and roll, sport, music, comedy. Now, much of this cultural potential, I would argue, has been obscured, however, following the economic and social transformations and technological that have transformed most Western nations since the 1980s. And those of you, like I was, a member of the ALP, we played our part in that transformation at a political level. Some of it was good and some of it wasn't so good, particularly for those communities that were traditionally termed working class. So we had the decline of the industrial sector relative to services, the rise of part-time, casual and contract employment, precarious employment if you like, the increase in school retention rates to year 12. I have particular responsibility for that one because I was part of the great Rodney Cavalier's machine at the Education Commission of New South Wales, and I was given the job of surveying working class young people about what would persuade them to stay longer at school. Ultimately, it may have been long-term unemployment that persuaded them to stay, but we were looking at structures that might make it more inviting, more culturally inviting. I don't know if that was an agenda or any of our work was really picked up. Other changes, easy access to credit. The bank manager, the accountant at the bank ceased to be that scary person that always said no when you wanted a home loan. Increasingly, a diverse mass immigration with new arrivals, particularly concentrated in lower wage service sector work, and the increasing feminisation and multiculturalism of the workforce as more women moved into work and, yes, a glass ceiling, but a big change from the 1970s onwards. Now, older forms of working class political organisation were challenged, rightly so, for privileging white male workers, for excluding women, for excluding ethnic minorities. Aboriginal people were making their claims, and so were other marginal groups. But I would add that unions were also at the forefront of advancing many of those issues and had been for a long time. But some of those structures were seen to be male-dominated of the labour movement. Now, online and social media had also restructured the whole terrain in which social relations are conducted, just as they've disrupted relations around friendship, commerce, sex and romance. They provided a different matrix for relations of class by giving and cue Donald Trump and cue potentially Barack Obama and some of the bright young people working for him, by giving unparalleled agency for direct expression, whether political or creative, to groups marginalised in recent decades by the opinion-leading mainstream media. So the tools that bohemians or well-to-do people have often had to be creative and make media are distributed widely now. There have been other times where this has occurred, but we're living through that moment now. Now, while Australian society is in many ways more prosperous, it is also far more unequal, not just in terms of wealth and income, and they're different things, wealth being shares, inherited, and property, income being what you're paid, maybe weekly, maybe fortnightly, maybe monthly, but also inequality in health and education outcomes. Communities traditionally termed working class divided, so the town I grew up in divided, with some moving ahead, highly skilled people, and others with insufficient and precarious work enduring long-term or partial unemployment, so the casualisation of the workforce. A greater group under pressure, and another group, which I made the documentary Nobody's Children about, but basically enduring long-term unemployment from the 1980s, not making that move into the induction, the rite of passage into adulthood, not getting those toehold jobs either, or losing their jobs in the 80s in the steel industry, which I happened to do a vacation job in, and at a time when they employed useless university students like myself to do labouring work. But very soon, within a few years, the actual people dependent on that work lost their jobs as unemployment grew. Now, that unemployment is now intergenerational, and in Nobody's Children we looked at that phenomena of a new underclass forming. Now, Australia's neoliberal globalising brand of capitalism has not done away with class based on one's relation to production, with many 21st century Australians in non-unionised employment experiencing exploitation, insecurity and managerial control not seen since the bad old days of the 19th century. And Terry Irving has recently written a wonderful article about this, which if we've got time we'll discuss later. At the same time, just like in the 19th century, middle class people are falling into the proletariat, the precariat, and into unemployment. And bourgeois work, professional work is being automated, not just by being sent to India, but anyone who's an academic knows, just to pick one occupation, maybe lawyers too, are spending so much of their time in online data entry systems. This is a new thing. At BHP, Steelworks never did such routine work as I do as an academic. That doesn't mean I don't do my core job, but I have to do this sort of proletarian work. So what's that old line? They came to take them away and I didn't do anything. Then they took the next people and did. Then when they came to take me, there was no one left. What this automation and proletarianising of work in the wake of new technology is now moving up to the upper middle classes. And what is interesting is the links that can be made between middle class people or the children of middle class people and the working class communities on this issue, which is just a thought to pack away that we might talk about later. But in terms of class, the important issue is reproduction of class. Otherwise, it's just stratification, just socioeconomic status. Class is reproduced over generations. So parents' occupations and education and community of origin continue to determine how most people perform at school and the jobs they end up with. As Tony Bennett, in that recent study some of you will have heard of, looking at the cultural pastimes of Australians based on class, show, culture remains a major way class is reproduced in Australia, and people are kept apart. But does this culture of the transformed working class, which we don't know much about? The Fabians went out in the 1890s, 1880s and academics throughout the 20s and 30s researching the condition of the working class. This began with Engels and Marx. They did the hard yards. We don't know about the transformed working class, the post-Keating working class. We get nostalgia about it. We don't know much. But the research is starting to be done by people like Tony Bennett and the project I'm involved in. But this is one of the ways that class is reproduced, that inequality is reproduced. But does this culture of the transformed working class contain the seeds of a resistance, of a fight back, as it did in the 1890s? Think of people like Henry Lawson. So the project I'm involved in argues, one, there is insufficient attention, both in Australian public debate, in policy, in scholarly research, to social class, and within class, when they do look at it, to its specific cultural dimension. Now, two, where class is invoked today in academia, policy and politics, it's often reproduced simply to disadvantage. Now, I have to say now, I hate that word disadvantage, and I'll explain why. It's as if nothing more than a point on a scale of income or wealth. Governments and well-meaning NGOs have conceptualised low-income communities as lacking capacity and sought to remediate, manage or compensate. Thus, differences in low-income communities from the wider society can appear only as inadequacy or failure against what are implicitly middle-class norms. Now, working class people in this charitable paradigm of disadvantage, and I'm not saying they do not experience hardship, but not very long ago the working class was seen as agents of modernity and history and progress. Not long ago in the 20th century. They still are today when they morph into the all-powerful voters of Western Sydney. So when an election's on, something interesting happens. They mightn't always be called working class then, but actually they frequently are. They're also said to have agency when they're ethnic gangs. So that construction of working class people, usually of non-English speaking background, constructed as ethnic gangs. They also have agency when they're police, military, security or emergency workers. So seen in that role, who are mainly working class people from working class backgrounds, or when they're striking or corrupt unionists that are pulling strings somehow. But our argument is that it's important to pay attention to the cultural dimension of class in the sense of Amartya Sen's positive capacities or capabilities, our capacity to change our world, change our treatment, to resist. Historically, the Australian working class conjured up rich associations with modes of speech, dress, food, uses of leisure time, attitudes towards money, the meaning of family, social relationships, and views about authority and ways to resist, that together made a whole way of life. You can read about this, get any newspapers from the 1880s and 1890s that are produced by the Labor Press or the Bulletin, and they talk about this culture. Now, these associations gave the working class a civic potency, manifested in political and industrial representation and impact on the wider Australian culture. Exemplary figures here include Louisa and Henry Lawson, politicians Mick Young, Neville Wran and Paul Keating, comedians like Paul Hogan or Graham Kennedy or Mary Hardy, sporting heroes Dawn Fraser, Bob Fulton, that's a rugby league person, Lionel Rose, and music legends like the Easy Beats, Cold Chisel and AC/DC. Now, the Labor Party, unions and indeed the Fabians were founded on the idea of working class people as creators of value and as a progressive historical force. My own experience growing up in industrial Port Kembla was that manual workers, men and women, most ethnicities on earth, working in the steelworks and the mines, were building modern Australia and governing themselves and often the country through the ALP, unions, co-ops, mutuals, their evening classes and DIY hobbies, rather than being the disadvantaged recipients of middle-class charity or coercive welfare administrators. Now, that was the post-war settlement. That was the change that was brought in. From the end of World War II into the 1980s as well, bright children of blue-collar backgrounds were not simply socially mobile into the middle classes through comprehensive education or scholarships, affordable home ownership, and they're all really important things, but they changed the character themselves of social democratic citizenship via sport, music, comedy, radio, TV. Their way of life was taken into the heart of what was considered Australia's national culture. Now, this is not nostalgia, but I'm conscious I'm from New South Wales, and I grew up in a working class community. But Labor governed in New South Wales, very different to Victoria. No split in the ALP. The Catholics stayed in the party, and they were in power for much of the 20th century, as Anthony Green constantly reminds us. It's not just nostalgia, but simply what a politically potent working class insisted on, that could not be ignored in a system of universal compulsory voting and mass ALP membership and militant unionism in a state where Labor was, as I said, the party of government, but the coalition shared a consensus on the role of public intervention. Now, while run by the educated upper middle class, commercial media and the ABC understood that early school leavers from working class backgrounds, though frequently subversive or transgressive and certainly vulgar on a good day, were the best at what they did and spoke for a popular anti-authoritarian Australian sensibility that in other works I've termed the larrikin carnivalesque. I'm not saying that the revolution will be won by television comedy, but in the absence of a lot, it helps. And certainly the Bulletin magazine and the Labor press mobilised humour to legitimise, not just humour, but pathos, melodrama, you name a genre, they were there in the late 19th and through the 20th century, new theatre, vaudeville, legitimating the Labor cause and delegitimating various enemies, including the capitalist fat man, for example. Now, I don't mean to be fattest there, by the way. Now, I want to, in the remaining time, how much time would I have left? Fine. I just want to focus on the retreat from the concept of class in three major areas, and this is sort of steering into policy, I suppose. But firstly, in the policy discourse, which has seen the ascendancy of stratification approaches over those of class since the 1970s. Secondly, in politics, where the Australian Labor Party abandoned an older historic investment in working class potency. And thirdly, in academic scholarship, where there's been a retreat from class as a critical analytical concept in preference to other modes of identity. Now, I have played in the sandpit of those other modes of identity. That's really valid and it was well overdue. But some of the best work in class in the 70s and 80s in the academy by people like R.W. Connell, Terry Irving, Bettina Cass, more recently by Ghassan Haj, Mary Kalantzis, effortlessly dealt with intersectionality between class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality. As human bodies, we're all these things and many. But class is the one that fell off the back of the truck. I want to make the point it's essential to look at the material dimension of inequality. There have been no end of great OECD reports, ACOS reports I myself wrote when I used to work in the policy sector, the Gonski Review, but they tend not to deal with culture. Now, no one would dream of looking at Aboriginal disadvantage, to use that word I don't like, without looking at their cultural capacities, or in fact non-English speaking migrants. It's a given that they have cultural capacities, and we deal with those from the ground up. Community empowerment, as it used to be called in the 70s. That is a given. But working class culture's kind of left for the comedians to analyse, and they do it well, the Kats and Kims, the people that do pizza, but we don't look at the capacities of these communities for what they can offer. Now there are exceptions, and we can talk about that later. But just a word about stratification. Connell made the point that it is a descriptive and not analytical concept. It's something that that just looks at socio-economic status, at levels of income. It doesn't explain why. And he made the point class is both historical and it's also about the collective, about power. So that it kind of came in the 70s. It influenced a lot of the reports done for the Whitlam government or the Whitlam opposition even before government. And it was valuable, but it kind of didn't look at the way class and inequalities are reproduced over time. It was about an individual kind of paradigm in opposition to more Marxist analysis. So it was about how people could be made more middle class, top them up, like pouring in more Milo or something, rather than, hey, these people have their own way of life that goes formed in the 18th, 19th century, formed in the 20th century, based on the conditions in which people lived, that has a lot to offer, even if there may be some negatives in it in terms of health or going to university, for example. That can't be done by this system, this mode of analysis known as stratification. So there were great people that were opposed to that, and their writings are as valid as ever. Connell, I mentioned, Anne Gaiman, Rosemary Pingle, Dean Ashton and Gary Dowsett in a wonderful book called Making the Difference, the best book ever on private and state schools, which I understand is an obsession of Victoria, having moved down here. But that book is really interesting. It looks at why working class women find working class men attractive, looks at gender, sexuality, ethnicity, but wrapped up with class in terms of the way school reproduces these things. And Terry Irving and Connell's book, Class Structure in Australian History, they are all informed by E.P. Thompson, Hobsbawm, those great people from English, cultural and social studies. Just in the final bit of time I've got, I want to talk very quickly about labour and class. Now, Brian and Renata Howe, who are both of you with us here tonight, said in, I think it's a Labour essay, 1984, which I didn't edit, I was still a student then, that Labour was in danger from its decline in working class representatives, MPs being pre-selected from working class backgrounds, but also membership, the working class membership declining. It was a vicarious representation of the working class. And if I can quote, Brian and Renata criticised this shift as patronising, replacing the sense of mission of the working class to modernise, improve society with a more middle-class charitable impulse to help and improve. That, I think, is combined with the embrace of stratification theory and methodology to policy, was the beginning of a move away from this notion of the dynamic working class as a force of historical transformation and something to be helped. All about social justice, all about good intentions, but a change. When I was growing up, we never thought of ourselves as disadvantaged. It was just not on. When I met Mark Latham many years later in the Fabian Society, I did think he, growing up in the Housing Commission and all of that, certainly it evoked a kind of how green is my valley kind of experience for him. And there were people certainly in Housing Commission in my community. But funnily enough, in those days, most Housing Commission people, and I'm sure it was the same for Mark's family, worked. In fact, both parents worked in Housing Commission. In my family, my mother worked until I was born. But, my father earned enough for my mother not to have to work with people in Housing Commission. Maybe both worked, but maybe they were teachers. So there was a drift away, and then we had the Hawke government, and this is how I actually first met Brian, who allowed people like me who represented the youth sector to come and lobby. But means tests became a kind of targeted rather than universal access to welfare. And what that did is it excluded that working sector of the working class, which is a large one, which earned too much money. Most labourers at the steelworks where I worked would have earned too much, especially if they do what were called doublers, double shifts, which most did. More of these targeted programs, targeted welfare benefits came in at the same time that much needed affirmative action was occurring for groups that had been excluded. Indigenous people, people from non-English speaking backgrounds. I worked in multicultural things. This stuff was long overdue, things for women. But a little bloke called John Howard was able to say the battlers were missing out. He was able to say he played on downward envy. And it was a real thing. I was making documentaries at the time, and a certain sector of the working class felt they were being ignored, and they were never addressed as such. Now, I did policy in those days, and I worked on International Youth Year, and every group was represented by the federal government. It had a subcommittee to do policy that I had to auspice, but class was not amongst them. So it actually did literally fall off the back of the truck. And I went to see Connell. I said, what do I do? There's no working class thing involved here, and they're really suffering with post-industrialisation, those transformations we talked about. And he said, well, every group that the Hawke government recognises, disability, Indigenous, women, working class people are, if not the majority, a really large section. So that was sort of his suggestion of how to deal with it. Now, so that happened under the Hawke-Keating government, and just for those who would have been at the Fabian meetings where these other things were discussed, after losing government to John Howard, a kind of social entrepreneurial new labour trend developed, which I published the book of, called Enabling Class, with Mark Latham, Peter Botsman and Noel Pearson, and that looked at how you could knit together the aspirational working class communities, the people doing well out of the Keating reforms, with that group of people who were now the bulk of housing estate, housing department clients, the new underclass. And part of that theory was that the state shouldn't manage or control people. And this is a big thing with working class people. When I was a kid, and if I misbehaved, my mother said, watch out or the welfare will take you. Now, we know Indigenous kids are told the same thing, but there's a notion of this managerial state, which has only grown stronger under neoliberalism, that people like us work in. You know, I have to administer compliance. We all have to be involved in compliance issues in this new regime, and working class people don't like that. And I guess part of the critique that I liked in the enabling state was looking at an alternative, a community kind of up model, but it did not come to pass. And along with another strand in the ALP, which was involved with Peter Walsh and Martin Ferguson and others, there was a kind of hostility to what, in a book called Labour Without Class, which I also published about at Pluto Press. We published a lot of books on this, about the development of hostility to political correctness. And I think that helped discredit class for the left of the Labor Party. It was seen as a kind of right-wing bully boy type thing. So they embraced these other important identities far more than class. So I'll end there, but when we break for groups, I'll flick through that PowerPoint, which has got some questions on it. Thank you.